Hello, everyone. My name is Beatrice Serena. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that no matter how hard things got, family was the one place I would always be safe. I was wrong. I didn't learn that lesson in a courtroom or during some dramatic confrontation. I learned it on a hospital bed, barely conscious, with stitches across my forehead and broken ribs making every breath feel like punishment. I learned it when the man who was supposed to protect me stood over me and decided that money mattered more than my life. What happened in that room wasn't just cruelty. It was a line being crossed that would eventually drag him into a collapse he never saw coming. Because the moment he raised his hand, he set off a chain of consequences that would strip him of his power, his reputation, and everything he thought he owned. At the time, though, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was the pain, the confusion, the cold realization that even at my lowest, I was nothing more than a transaction to him. And the irony is this. The very moment he tried to break me for good was the moment he unknowingly signed his own downfall. Before I continue, if stories about quiet endurance, betrayal behind closed doors, and strength that grows in the dark resonate with you, please take a second to like this video. Subscribe if you want to hear how truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every message, and your support truly means more than you know. The accident happened 3 days before that hospital confrontation. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my car. I remember the sound of metal folding in on itself, the steering wheel jerking violently, and then a silence that felt heavier than noise. When I woke up, the doctor told me I was lucky to be alive. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, 27 stitches across my forehead, enough bruising to make me look like I'd gone a few rounds with a professional boxer. The pain medication dulled the edges, but it didn't erase the ache that pulsed through my chest every time I breathed. Worse, the other driver's insurance company was already pushing back, suggesting I might share some of the blame. I had been stopped at a red light when he hit me, but logic didn't matter when lawyers were involved. Stress crept in fast, settling on top of the physical pain like a second weight. That's when my father came to visit. Richard Serena didn't walk into my hospital room with concern. He walked in with rage. His face was red, his jaw tight, his presence filling the room in a way that made the nurse suddenly find an urgent reason to leave. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't look at the stitches or the IV in my arm. He got straight to the point. The rent was overdue. I thought I'd misheard him. I was still foggy from medication, still adjusting to the idea that I could have died. When I told him I didn't have the money, when I reminded him I had been unconscious for 2 days, his expression didn't soften, it hardened. He told me the first of the month had passed. He told me excuses didn't pay bills. He told me that if I thought being injured gave me special treatment, I was wrong. I tried to reason with him. I mentioned the accident, the hospital, the fact that I had been paying for that room since I was 18, in the house my mother had helped pay for before she died. I suggested carefully that maybe my health should matter more than a few $100s. That's when he snapped. The slap came out of nowhere. One moment, he was standing at the foot of my bed. The next, his hand connected with my face so hard that I slid sideways and hit the floor. Pain exploded through my ribs. My IV tore out. I tasted blood and felt something in my chest crack in a way that made me scream. The monitor started beeping wildly, alarms filling the room, but no one came. From the floor, I looked up at him, stunned, not just by the pain, but by the certainty in his eyes. There was no hesitation, no regret, only disgust. "You think you're too good for this family," he sneered. Behind him, his wife, Diane, gave a nervous little laugh, the kind people make when they don't want to acknowledge what they're seeing. My younger brother, Tyler, leaned against the door frame, scrolling on his phone, barely glancing up. And somewhere in the hallway, my father's much younger girlfriend chewed her gum and checked her reflection. completely detached from the fact that a man twice her age had just hit his injured daughter. I lay there on the hospital floor, shaking, humiliated, and painfully aware that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was who he had always been, a man who saw me not as his child, but as a source of income that had failed him. "You've got 3 days," he said finally. "Pay up or get out." Those words hit harder than the impact of the crash. 3 days spoken to a woman who could barely stand, who had nowhere else to go, who was still bleeding. As he turned and walked out, I realized something terrifying and clarifying all at once. If I didn't disappear quietly, he was going to make sure I suffered. 3 days later, I was discharged with a plastic bag of prescriptions and a stack of instructions that all said the same thing in different words. Rest, recover, don't push yourself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rest required safety. Recovery required stability, and I had neither. Richard Serena didn't come to get me. Instead, he sent my brother. Tyler showed up 20 minutes late, leaning against his car like this was an inconvenience he hadn't planned for. He complained about traffic, then about gas prices, then about how tight money was for him right now. During the 15-minute drive, every pothole sent sharp pain through my ribs, but he never slowed down. When we pulled into the driveway, he held out his hand and asked for gas money. I gave him $5, not because I wanted to, but because I needed the other $5 for the bus to physical therapy the next morning. The house looked the same from the outside. Same trimmed lawn, same quiet street in Cedar Falls, same place I had lived since I was a teenager. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something had shifted. It was colder. Not temperature-wise, emotionally, like I'd walked into a space that no longer recognized me. Amber's things were everywhere. Her yoga mats stretched across the living room floor. Protein shakes crowded the section of the fridge I used to keep my groceries. Her flat iron sat on the bathroom counter next to a handwritten sign taped to the door that read Amber's Glam Room with a little heart drawn over the eye. She was fully moved in while I'd been in the hospital. Diane was sitting at the kitchen table shuffling papers. She froze when she saw me and swept them into a stack, covering them with a magazine. I caught a glimpse of my own name before she hid them, my social security number. She laughed nervously and asked how I was feeling. "Fine," I said, because explaining pain to people who didn't care felt pointless. I went to my room and stopped short. There was a padlock on my closet, not the door. The closet. Inside that closet were my work clothes, my laptop, my documents, everything I needed to function. A sticky note was taped to the lock in my father's handwriting. "See Richard for key, rent first." I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at that cheap metal lock like it was something alive. My ribs throbbed, my head pounded. My phone buzzed with emails from work, missed deadlines, check-in messages, thinly veiled warnings. I couldn't even answer them. My computer was locked away 3 feet from where I was sitting. The next morning, I left early for physical therapy. I moved slowly, carefully, each step reminding me that my body hadn't caught up with reality yet. When I came back 2 hours later, my key didn't work. I tried again and again. The lock had been changed. I stood there on the porch, still sore, still bruised, still not fully steady on my feet, jiggling a useless key in a door that no longer opened for me. Eventually, it swung inward. Amber stood there wearing one of my robes, the silk one my grandmother had given me for graduating college. "Oh," she said, popping her gum. "Richard said you don't live here anymore." She tried to close the door. I wedged my foot in before she could. Pain shot up my side, sharp enough to make my vision blur, but I didn't move. From the doorway, I could see the living room. My father sat on the couch. Diane hovered nearby. Tyler leaned against the wall, and standing in the middle of the room was a man I didn't recognize at first, until I realized he was one of my father's golf buddies, Craig Whitmore. They were discussing my room. Craig was gesturing toward the hallway, talking about square footage and rental potential. He said 800 was too low. Said they could easily get $1,200 a month for a room with a private bathroom. Tyler laughed like it was a joke. Diane nodded along, hands folded tight. They were planning my replacement. When Richard noticed me, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You had 3 days," he said. I tried to explain about my things, about my work computer, about the fact that I needed my documents. He cut me off and said I could have everything back once I paid the overdue rent and a security deposit for the new agreement. $1,200 a month. I was still standing there when Mrs. Carol Park from next door came outside to water her plants. She watched the scene unfold with quiet alarm, then hurried over and pressed something into my hand when Richard turned away. $300 and a key. "You can stay in my shed tonight," she whispered. Before I could thank her, Richard stepped back outside and threatened her. Told her he'd report her son's food truck to the health department. Said he'd make sure violations ruined him. Mrs. Park's face fell, and she retreated without another word. I signed the new rental agreement with shaking hands, not because I intended to honor it, but because I needed access to my belongings. Richard promised I could come back the next day with the money and get everything. As he spoke, Tyler was already wearing my sweatshirt, and Diane had my laptop bag over her shoulder. That night, I slept on a folding chair in Mrs. Park's garden shed, surrounded by bags of soil and fertilizer. The smell was sharp, the floor was hard, but it was shelter. And lying there in the dark, listening to my own breathing finally slow, I made a decision. If my father wanted to erase me, I would stop begging to be let back in. I would figure out exactly what he'd done and why he was so confident I'd never fight back. By the end of that week, I was officially homeless. Mrs. Park's shed had been a temporary mercy, but it was never meant to be a solution. My body needed a real bed, and she needed her space back without my father looming next door, inventing threats. That's how I ended up on Megan Carter's couch. My best friend, my quiet constant, the person who didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Megan worked night shifts as a nurse. Our schedules barely overlapped. She would leave a mug of coffee on the counter with a sticky note. "You're safe here. Don't rush." I'd leave dinner warming on the stove and a short update about whatever new complication had surfaced that day. We became ships passing in the night, connected by notes, shared exhaustion, and the unspoken understanding that this was temporary. The physical pain faded slowly. Bruises shifted from angry purple to sickly green. The stitches itched as they healed. What didn't fade was the unease, a low, persistent hum in my chest that told me something was wrong, deeply wrong, about everything that had just happened. It started with a phone call to my bank. I needed to know how much damage missing work had done. Instead of answers, the woman on the other end of the line asked me to verify charges I didn't recognize. A credit card I'd never opened, a balance just over $5,000. There had to be a mistake. I called another company, then another. Each time, the same pattern. Cards opened within the last 6 months, all tied to my social security number, all listing my father's address as the billing location. By the time I hung up the fourth call, my hands were shaking. $15,000 in debt I had never authorized. Diane. The realization landed hard, the nervous laughter, the papers she'd hidden on the kitchen table, the way she'd asked how I was feeling without meeting my eyes. She hadn't just locked my things away. She'd been quietly hollowing me out. That night, lying on Megan's couch with my phone glowing above me, I started pulling threads. Credit agencies, old statements, digital paper trails. Each answer led to 2 more questions. And beneath all of it, one thought refused to let go. My father wasn't worried about rent. He was worried about exposure. I thought about the house, how my mother had helped pay for it before she died, how it had somehow become solely his afterward. I thought about the years I'd covered expenses while he claimed he couldn't work, the stories never quite lining up, the money always moving, always disappearing. For the first time, I let myself consider the possibility that what I was dealing with wasn't just cruelty. It was calculation, There was one thing they hadn't taken from me when they locked my closet: an old laptop. I'd hidden it years earlier under a loose floorboard in my room back when privacy in that house had felt like a luxury. The screen was cracked. The battery barely held a charge, but it worked. And more importantly, it held something I'd never talked about with anyone in my family. For 3 years, I had been building something quietly. After watching small businesses get crushed by fraud at my marketing job, owners blindsided by partners, accounts drained overnight, I'd started learning how money really moved, how to trace it, how to follow patterns no one wanted you to see. It began as curiosity, turned into late nights, then into a private project I worked on when everyone else slept. I'd never called it a business out loud, but I'd built systems, templates, a way to see through lies that looked clean on the surface. At the time, it had felt like insurance against a future I couldn't name yet. Now, sitting on Megan's couch, ribs aching as I balanced the laptop on my knees, it felt like something else entirely. A lifeline. I didn't jump straight to action. I observed. I documented screenshots, dates, names, patterns. Every time I uncovered something new, I resisted the urge to confront anyone. Confrontation without leverage was just noise. And noise was what my father thrived on. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Aunt Alina answered on the second ring. When she heard my voice, she went silent. Then she cried. "I've been waiting for this call for 15 years, she said. My father had cut her out of our lives after my mother's funeral. Told us she was unstable, bitter, a bad influence. I had believed him because it was easier than questioning the only parent I had left. Alina didn't rush me. She listened. And when I told her about the accident, the eviction, the debt, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded angry. "There are things you need to know," she said. "Things your mother tried to protect." We made plans to meet quietly, away from Cedar Falls. She said she had documents she'd kept, letters, copies of paperwork she'd never trusted my father with. At the time, I didn't know how important that would become. I only knew that the fog I'd been living in was starting to lift. A week passed. I was fired from my job via email. Job abandonment, they called it. A former coworker messaged me privately to apologize. She said my father had called the office, told them I was in rehab for drug addiction, sent a photo of me on the hospital floor after he hit me, and claimed it was drug-related. I stared at the message for a long time before closing my eyes. That was the moment something inside me went cold. He wasn't just erasing me from his house. He was erasing me from my life. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't damage control. It was a pattern, years in the making, one I had survived without realizing how close I'd come to disappearing completely. I shut the laptop and leaned back, breathing carefully, deliberately. If my father thought I was broken, desperate, and powerless, he was going to keep making mistakes. And for the first time since the accident, I felt something shift, not hope, focus, because I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was starting to understand the game he'd been playing. And I was done being the only one following the rules. Understanding the game didn't mean I was ready to play it openly. Not yet. What I needed first was proof. Something solid enough that it couldn't be explained away, laughed off, or buried under my father's voice. Suspicion without evidence was just paranoia. And Richard Serena had spent decades training everyone around him to doubt anything that challenged his version of events. The opportunity came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Amber posted an Instagram story from a casino 2 hours south of Cedar Falls. Neon lights, slot machines, her arm looped through my father's like a prize she'd won. Diane and Tyler appeared briefly in the background of one clip, all smiles and drinks in hand. They were gone for the day. Megan was at work. My ribs still protested when I moved too fast, but I could breathe without flinching now. I took the bus back toward my old neighborhood, heart thudding harder with every stop. I didn't tell myself I was breaking in. I told myself I was going home. The window to my old room had always been loose. It had been that way since I was 16, the summer I'd snuck out to a school dance my father forbade. He never fixed it. He never noticed things unless they cost him money. I used a butter knife to pry it open, each small movement sending a dull ache through my side. The window gave way with a soft pop, and I climbed in slowly, carefully, landing in the room I'd grown up in. It looked like a storm had passed through. Drawers yanked open, clothes tossed onto the floor, shelves stripped bare. They'd taken anything that looked valuable and left the rest scattered like debris. My work laptop was gone, jewelry boxes empty, even my childhood photos were missing. I stood there for a moment, letting the reality settle. Then I knelt and lifted the loose floorboard near the wall. The old laptop was still there. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Small mercies mattered more when everything else felt hostile. I tucked it into my bag and moved quietly down the hall. My father's office was exactly where it had always been. Same heavy desk, same filing cabinets, same terrible painting of a lighthouse he'd bought at a garage sale 20 years ago and insisted was worth a fortune. The safe was behind it. The combination was my mother's birthday. He had never changed it. Predictability was his weakness. Inside the safe, the truth waited for me. At first, it didn't look dramatic, just folders, envelopes, flash drives, the kind of clutter that only seemed harmless if you didn't know what you were looking for. My hands started shaking as I opened the first folder. Life insurance documents. My mother's name, her signature, a policy worth $1.5 million, paid out after her sudden heart attack when she was 39. I was 14. Tyler was 11. The policy stated clearly that the money was to be placed in trust for her children, accessible for education and living expenses once we turned 18. I had received nothing. Tyler had received nothing. We had taken out student loans, worked part-time jobs, struggled. Meanwhile, my father had somehow afforded a new truck, a boat, annual trips to Vegas, a lifestyle that never quite matched his supposed inability to work. I flipped through more documents, bank statements, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, offshore holdings. My stomach tightened as pieces slid into place. Then I found the letter dated a week before my mother died from her doctor. It warned about a dangerous interaction between her heart medication and a supplement that could cause fatal arrhythmias. The language was cautious but clear. Stop taking it immediately. 2 pages later, there was a prescription receipt. Same supplement, prescribed by a doctor I'd never heard of, filled at a pharmacy 2 towns over. The date was 2 days after the warning letter. My vision blurred. I didn't let myself draw conclusions. Not yet. Conclusions without proof were dangerous. But suspicion, cold, heavy suspicion, settled into my bones. I took photos of everything. Insurance policies, trust documents, bank transfers, tax filings. Medicare forms where my father was still claiming my mother as a dependent years after her death. Records showing he'd claimed Tyler and me on his taxes long after we'd filed on our own. Then I saw the USB drive labeled simply, Backup 2019. Footsteps sounded downstairs. I froze. Voices drifted in, complaints about traffic, about losing money at the casino. They were back early. I slid the USB into my pocket, closed the safe, and replaced the lighthouse painting just as footsteps hit the stairs. My hands moved on instinct now, body obeying adrenaline instead of pain. The window wouldn't close properly from the inside. I left it as it was, grabbed the old laptop and a few clothes they hadn't bothered to take, and slipped out the back door as my father entered his office. I didn't stop walking until I was 3 blocks away. That night, sitting at Megan's kitchen table while she slept upstairs, I plugged the USB into the old laptop. It was worse than I'd imagined. 15 years of tax evasion. Fraudulent disability claims backed by videos of my father golfing, lifting weights, helping friends move heavy furniture. Emails discussing how to hide assets from the IRS. Correspondence with a lawyer about accessing trust funds meant for children if you held power of attorney. It wasn't chaos. It was organized, deliberate. I closed the laptop slowly, my heartbeat steady now. This wasn't just about rent or eviction or cruelty. This was a system, and systems could be dismantled if you knew where to apply pressure. For the first time since the accident, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. And my father had no idea that the story he'd built so carefully was already starting to unravel. Planning didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity came with weight. Once you see the shape of a system built to exploit, you can't unsee it. Every memory reorders itself. Every excuse collapses. Sitting at Megan's kitchen table, the USB drive beside my cracked laptop, I realized that what I had uncovered wasn't a single crime or even a series of bad decisions. It was a long game. I spent the next few days moving carefully, quietly. I made copies of everything, stored in places my father would never think to look. Cloud accounts under aliases, physical backups hidden in locations that weren't connected to me. I slept lightly, my mind replaying conversations from years ago with new meaning. The nights were the hardest. That was when the questions crept in. How long had he been planning this? How much had he taken? And how many people had looked the other way? The call with Aunt Alina came at the end of that week. We met at a diner 2 towns away from Cedar Falls, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and nostalgia. Vinyl booths cracked with age, a bell above the door that rang every time someone came in. It felt neutral, safe. She looked older than I remembered, more gray, more lines. But when she smiled, I saw my mother immediately. Same eyes. Same way of holding herself, like she was braced against disappointment but still standing. She slid a cardboard box across the table without ceremony. "I kept everything," she said, "because I never trusted him." Inside were letters my mother had written but never mailed, copies of legal documents, notes scribbled in the margins of bank statements. Alina told me my mother had been planning to divorce Richard. She'd hired a lawyer. She documented his gambling, his affairs, his temper. The heart attack happened 2 weeks before the first court date. "I thought something was wrong," Alina said quietly, "but I didn't have proof, and once she was gone, he made sure I was gone too." I showed her what I'd found. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She nodded. "That explains the silence," she said. "The money, the sudden confidence." Alina gave me a name, Daniel Harrington. He was the attorney my mother had hired before she died. Still practicing, still in Boston, still remembered her. I made the call the next morning. Harrington's office smelled like old leather and paper when I walked in tradition and permanence. He studied the documents carefully, flipping pages with a precision that told me he already understood the gravity of what he was seeing. When I handed him the USB drive, he didn't smile. He leaned back in his chair. "He didn't just steal from you," Harrington said. "He stole from a trust and from the state and possibly from your mother while she was still alive." The word possibly hung between us. "We can build a case," he continued, "but it has to be methodical, quiet. If he senses pressure too early, he'll destroy what he can." I nodded. That part made sense. Richard Serena didn't fight clean. He fought to win or to burn everything down. While Harrington began preparing filings, I kept digging. Diane had opened 3 more credit cards in my name. I found the applications, the purchases, essential oils, inventory, membership fees. She'd even tried to list me as part of her sales downline, earning commissions off a business I didn't know existed. Tyler had started selling my grandmother's jewelry online. Quick cash, no questions asked. I tracked the listings, documenting each one. The pearl necklace, the wedding ring set, pieces that had survived 4 generations and were now being pawned to cover his debts. Amber surprised me the most. She called late one night, drunk and crying. She'd discovered my father had another girlfriend, someone even younger than she was. She wanted revenge, thought I might help. I didn't argue. I listened. Over cheap cocktails at a dim bar, She confessed she'd been documenting everything for months: screenshots, videos, recordings. My father practicing his limp before doctor's appointments, coaching her on how to apply for credit cards in other people's names, counting cash from under-the-table jobs while collecting disability. She slid her phone across the table. "I want to watch him burn," she said. I told her she could. By the time I left that bar, my phone held more evidence than most investigations start with. The dominoes were lining up. The IRS whistleblower program required patience. The Social Security Administration moved slowly until it didn't. Identity theft crossed a threshold where law enforcement could no longer ignore it. Each piece alone was manageable. Together, they were devastating. And while my father continued renovating my old room into a short-term rental, posting smiling photos online about a charming space in a family home, he had no idea that his foundation was already cracking. I returned to Megan's apartment one evening and opened my laptop, not to investigate this time, but to work. The project I'd been building quietly for years finally had a purpose beyond theory. I registered the business, secured the domain, finalized contracts I'd drafted long before I knew I'd need them. Clients began signing on within days, small business owners desperate to recover money stolen by people they trusted. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce it. I simply prepared because everything was in motion now: the law, the evidence, the finances, the people he thought were loyal, turning away one by one. The system Richard Serena had built to protect himself was about to do the opposite. And I intended to be very precise about where the first visible crack appeared. The first cracks didn't announce themselves with sirens or subpoenas. They showed up as panic. I started hearing about it through Mrs. Park. She'd text me small updates the way neighbors do when they're pretending not to watch something unravel in real time. My father pacing the driveway late at night. Diane arguing with him on the porch in sharp whispers that carried farther than they thought. Tyler coming and going at odd hours, always looking over his shoulder. They were running out of room to lie to each other. Diane was the first to lose control. One afternoon, while she was hosting an essential oils party in the living room, candles lit, folding chairs arranged, suburban smiles carefully practiced, the police knocked on the door. 12 women sat frozen as officers read her name aloud and asked her to step outside. She laughed through the entire arrest, that familiar brittle sound, even as they explained the charges. Identity theft, credit fraud, multiple counts. Mrs. Park told me later that the laughter didn't stop until the car door closed. The credit card companies moved quickly after that. Accounts frozen, immediate repayment demanded. Investigations opened into whether my father had known what Diane was doing. I had emails proving it, but those were for later. Tyler didn't handle the pressure well. The people he'd borrowed from weren't patient. And without my father's accounts to cover his losses, Tyler ran out of options. He started selling things faster, sloppier. That was how I was able to track down the pawn shop owner who'd bought my grandmother's jewelry. I explained the situation. He listened quietly, then nodded. "Your mother was a good woman," he said. "Thieves don't get rewarded." I bought everything back for half of what Tyler had gotten. Amber's evidence turned out to be the hinge. She hadn't just recorded my father. She documented patterns, dates, times, instructions he gave her without realizing she was keeping track. Videos of him coaching her on how to sound injured. Screenshots of messages where he discussed hiding cash. Proof that he'd been selling prescription pills he obtained for his fake back pain. She handed it all over without ceremony. "I'm done being disposable," she said. The IRS audit started quietly, accounts frozen, transactions flagged. My father's card declined at a warehouse store one afternoon, and Mrs. Park texted me 17 exclamation points. The certified letter arrived a week later. Tyler signed for it, thinking it was something he'd ordered online. When my father opened it, the color drained from his face. 5 years of tax filings initially, but audits had a way of expanding. Once discrepancies appeared, and they did quickly, the scope widened. Cash jobs he'd never reported, assets hidden under other names, transfers routed through accounts that didn't match his story of disability and hardship. He tried to explain it away, blamed mistakes, claimed confusion, said he'd relied on bad advice. The IRS didn't argue. They documented. While that machinery turned, the Social Security Administration took its time. They gathered footage, cross-referenced travel data, compared medical records with activity logs from the safe driving device he'd installed to lower his insurance premiums. It showed him driving daily during the exact years he'd claimed he couldn't leave his bed. When the notice finally arrived, it wasn't dramatic. It was precise. 5 years of fraudulent disability payments, full repayment, penalties, interest, possible criminal charges. He stopped sleeping after that. Mrs. Park said the lights stayed on until dawn, that he paced from room to room, phone pressed to his ear, leaving messages no one returned. Diane couldn't help him from jail. Tyler had already stepped back, trying to salvage what little he could for himself. For the first time, Richard Serena was alone with his own paperwork. Desperation makes people careless. That's how Amber ended up calling me again, this time sober and furious. She'd found messages between my father and another girl, barely 18. Plans, promises, instructions on how to cut off family. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just replaced her. She wanted revenge. I gave her a road map. Tyler made his final mistake when he realized my father had been claiming him as a dependent for tax purposes for years without telling him. That meant Tyler was implicated too. Faced with charges he hadn't anticipated, he folded. He turned on my father without hesitation. By then, the family had stopped pretending to be united. Diane was in jail, negotiating a plea deal. Amber had moved out, taking her evidence with her. Tyler was scrambling to save himself, and my father was alone in a house that no longer felt like a fortress. I stayed invisible. My business was gaining traction quietly. Contracts signed, fees paid, work completed with precision. I didn't post about it. I didn't celebrate. I documented. I prepared. I watched. Because what was happening now wasn't the final collapse. It was the first layer peeling away. The image my father had cultivated, the struggling man taken advantage of, the provider wronged by an ungrateful daughter, was gone. In its place was something much harder to defend. A pattern. And patterns don't care how loudly you deny them. They just keep repeating until someone finally forces them into the light. The second layer didn't fall all at once. It moved in stages, slow enough that my father believed he could still outrun it, but steady enough that every step forward only dragged him deeper. That was when the trust fund surfaced. Daniel Harrington filed the lawsuit on a Wednesday morning. He didn't alert the press. He didn't grandstand. He had the papers served quietly, right at the golf club my father loved, in front of the men he'd spent years impressing with stories about his resilience and sacrifice. The lawsuit was clear. $1.5 million plus interest plus damages. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of trust assets. The accusation wasn't emotional. It was structural. It laid out exactly how the money had been taken, where it had gone, and how it had been used to support a lifestyle my brother and I had never benefited from. The reaction was immediate. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Craig Whitmore, the golf buddy who'd helped him hide money, suddenly had his own problems when the IRS showed up at his used car dealership. Turns out, helping someone commit fraud makes you part of the story, whether you like it or not. My father tried to spin it. He told anyone who would listen that I was a disgruntled daughter, that I was exaggerating, that grief had twisted my memory. He even went on local radio to say I was doing this for attention. The host played audio from my father's disability hearing, where he'd claimed he couldn't walk without pain. Then he played video from the same week, of my father carrying a refrigerator up a flight of stairs. The call-in show ended early. It became a clip, then a meme. The trust fund case triggered something no one had planned for, a review. Once authorities looked closely at the insurance payout, the timing of my mother's death raised questions. Nothing accusatory, nothing definitive, just enough irregularities to reopen files that had been closed too quickly years earlier. I didn't push for it. I didn't need to. The documentation spoke for itself. By then, my father's world had narrowed to legal calls and unopened mail. He tried to liquidate assets, but everything worth selling was frozen. He tried to borrow money, but his credit had collapsed. He reached out to distant relatives, old coworkers, anyone he thought might still believe him. Most didn't respond. Those who did asked questions he couldn't answer. Meanwhile, my life moved in the opposite direction. Serena Forensic Advisory had launched quietly, almost anticlimactically. My first clients weren't dramatic cases, just people desperate to recover money stolen by partners they trusted. I traced accounts, followed transactions, recovered funds. Word spread. I didn't celebrate. I stayed focused. Because the system I was dismantling wasn't just my father's. It was a pattern I'd seen repeated everywhere, power hiding behind confusion, counting on exhaustion to keep people silent. The lawsuit hearings approached. The audits deepened. The disability investigation accelerated. And through it all, my father kept making the same mistake. He underestimated patience. He thought pressure came from shouting, from threats, from confrontation. He didn't understand that the most dangerous force he'd ever face was already in motion, quiet, documented, and impossible to intimidate. By the time he realized the second layer had collapsed, there was nothing left for him to grab onto. And the final reckoning was no longer a question of if. It was simply a matter of when. The reckoning arrived without drama. No warning call, no final confrontation, just a sequence of dates circled on calendars that no longer belonged to my father. The first courtroom appearance wasn't criminal. It was procedural. Motions, filings, lawyers speaking in calm, measured tones, while Richard Serena sat stiffly beside his attorney, jaw clenched, eyes darting as if the room itself had turned hostile. I wasn't there in person. I didn't need to be. Daniel Harrington handled the trust fund case with the kind of precision that left no room for theatrics. The numbers spoke. $1.5 million misappropriated. Interest compounded over 15 years. Damages added. The total climbed past $2 million before the judge finished reading. There was no emotional language in the ruling, just facts, timelines, signatures, transfers. My father stared straight ahead as if refusing to look might make it disappear. The criminal side moved faster than anyone expected. Once the IRS expanded the audit beyond 5 years, the volume of evidence changed everything. Tax evasion stacked on top of fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. Each charge built on documentation my father had created himself. Emails, records, transactions he'd assumed no one would ever line up in the same place. The Social Security Administration finalized its findings soon after. 5 years of fraudulent disability payments, $230,000 owed back, plus penalties. The report was blunt, the conclusion unavoidable. The arrest came on a Thursday morning, not at home, not quietly. Officers walked onto the green while my father stood mid-swing, his driver frozen in the air as they said his name. Members stopped what they were doing. Phones came out. Whispers spread faster than the explanation. By the time he was led away, the story had already escaped the club's gates. The media latched on quickly. A local reporter had been tracking the trust fund lawsuit after the service at the golf club. Once the arrest hit, everything connected. Headlines followed a familiar pattern. Local man accused of defrauding dead wife's trust. Daughter left homeless after hospital incident. The footage from the hospital surfaced next. Security cameras don't lie, and they don't forget. The video showed exactly what I remembered, my father standing over me, the sudden movement, my body hitting the floor, the alarms going off as no one intervened. Public sympathy shifted instantly. The radio station that had once given my father airtime invited him back to respond. He tried. He stumbled through half-explanations, blamed stress, accused me of exaggeration. The host played the hospital footage, then played the disability hearing audio, then asked one question my father couldn't answer. The interview ended early. Online, the clip took on a life of its own. I stayed offline. The trial date was set for 3 months out, but the damage was immediate. Assets seized, vehicles tagged, boats, electronics. Anything tied to the trust fund or unreported income flagged for auction. Diane took a plea deal. 18 months, full restitution. Tyler received probation and wage garnishment. He'd traded testimony for leniency, his voice flat as he confirmed details he'd once pretended not to know. The trust fund judgment was finalized the same week. $2.1 million. My father's total liability crossed $3 million before the criminal trial even began. He declared bankruptcy. It didn't help. Fraud judgments don't disappear. The sentencing hearing was quiet. No shouting, no grand statements, just a judge reading through a list of actions that spanned 15 years. Stealing from children, lying to federal agencies, exploiting disability systems meant to protect people who actually needed them. When the judge asked if there were victim impact statements, I stood. My voice didn't shake. I talked about growing up without my mother, about working multiple jobs while my father lived comfortably off money meant for us, about the hospital, the slap, the moment I realized my safety meant less to him than rent. Then I talked about what came after, about rebuilding, about choosing transparency where secrecy had ruled, about creating something that helped others recover from the same kind of abuse. "You tried to bury me," I said, "not knowing I was a seed." The courtroom stayed silent. The sentence followed. 15 years in federal prison, no early release for 5. My father didn't look at me as they led him away. I didn't look back. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt final. And as the doors closed behind him, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't revenge. It was balance. And it had taken exactly as long as it needed to. The silence after the sentencing lasted longer than I expected. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because for the first time in years, nothing was chasing me. No deadlines driven by fear. No threats disguised as family obligations. No voice telling me to shrink so someone else could feel larger. The fallout unfolded quietly. Diane began serving her sentence, sending letters I never opened. Tyler started working for the first time in his life, his wages garnished, his excuses gone. We exchanged one letter, just one. He admitted what he'd done. Not dramatically, not for sympathy. I told him forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for. It was something he had to earn day by day. Whether we would ever be siblings again remained unanswered. The house was foreclosed within months. Without stolen money propping it up, the payments collapsed. It went to auction, and in a twist that felt almost intentional, Mrs. Park's son bought it. He turned it into a small community center. Language classes, paperwork help, shared meals. A plaque went up by the front door with my mother's name on it. That part mattered more than I expected. My life expanded in the opposite direction. Serena Forensic Advisory grew steadily. No overnight explosion. Just trust earned one client at a time. We helped people recover money, rebuild records, and regain control after betrayal. Within the year, we'd recovered tens of millions for clients who thought everything was gone. I hired carefully, trained deliberately, built systems that favored transparency over ego. The blog followed, then the book deal. I told the story not to relive the pain, but to map the exit for others. The messages started arriving, women mostly, whispering their own versions of what I'd survived. Financial abuse by family members, isolation, shame, fear. That's how the foundation began. The Serena Financial Freedom Fund wasn't built on anger. It was built on relief, emergency housing, legal guidance, financial counseling, the kind of support I'd needed before I knew how to ask for it. Our first grants went to 10 women under 30, all escaping situations that looked painfully familiar. Watching them stabilize felt like closure in motion. I bought a modest house near Mrs. Park, a garden out back, yellow roses, the kind my mother loved. Some evenings I'd sit on the porch and let myself feel everything I'd postponed. Grief, pride, exhaustion, gratitude. Not all at once, just enough to remind myself I was human again. The call from the IRS came months later. The whistleblower payment landed on a random Tuesday, just over $200,000. I stared at the number for a long time, then allocated it quietly. Half to the foundation, half to expansion. Justice redistributed. I don't follow updates from the prison. I don't need to. Knowing where my father is doesn't change where I'm going. What I carry forward isn't the damage, it's the clarity. If you're listening to this and you recognize pieces of your own life in mine, if you've been made to feel small, expendable, or replaceable, please know this. Systems built on silence depend on your exhaustion. You don't have to confront them loudly. You just have to stop protecting them. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear that survival doesn't have to be the end of the story. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't fighting back.